The man who invented the guillotine didn't want to kill anyone. He was a doctor. He spent 30 years treating the poor in the hospitals of Paris. He fought to make medicine accessible to people who couldn't afford it. He believed, with the particular intensity of the Enlightenment, that reason could make the world less cruel. And then, one morning in 1793, he woke up in a prison cell, waiting to be executed by the machine that carried his name. Let that sit for a moment. The inventor, the prison cell, his own machine. Operating 2 miles away, every morning, while he waited to hear if today was the day his name appeared on the list. We think we know what the guillotine is. We've seen the images, the blade, the crowd, the basket. We've absorbed it through 2 centuries of history books and films and cultural shorthand until it became a symbol so familiar it stopped meaning anything specific. But the specific is exactly where the real story lives. Because the guillotine was not born in violence. It was born in a doctor's belief that suffering could be engineered out of death. That if you made execution fast enough, painless enough, equal enough across every class and rank, you could strip it of its power. Make it so unremarkable that eventually a civilized society would simply stop doing it. That was the plan. The revolution had other plans. And what happened between Guillotine's proposal in October 1789 and his arrest in October 1793 is not just a story about the French Revolution. It is a precise and reproducible case study in how power hijacks the tools built to constrain it. It has happened before. It is happening now. It will happen again. The only variable is whose name ends up on the machine. But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. On October 10, 1789, a physician stood before the French National Assembly and proposed something radical. Not a tax, not a law, not a declaration of war. A method of execution. His name was Joseph Ignace Guillotin. He was a doctor, a professor of anatomy at the University of Paris, and according to the Archives Nationales in Paris, his exact words to the assembly that day were a proposal for equality, that every condemned person, regardless of social rank, should die by the same method. Quickly, painless.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
With dignity. He said, and the record is clear on this, the machine would feel like nothing more than a light breeze on the back of the neck. The assembly received the proposal with discomfort. Some laughed. Guillotin was not laughing. He had spent years watching the French judicial system apply cruelty proportional to poverty. Nobles died by sword, fast, considered honorable. Common people were hanged, broken on the wheel, sometimes burned. The same crime, radically different deaths. Guillotin found this morally intolerable. His machine was meant to end that inequality forever. Here is what the official historical record also shows, and this is the part that doesn't fit the story. Guillotin was opposed to the death penalty entirely. He didn't want a better execution machine. He wanted executions to seem so clinical, so mechanical, so devoid of spectacle that the public would eventually lose its appetite for them altogether. He believed that if you removed the theater of suffering from public execution, the institution itself would wither and die. According to Daniel Aras's 1989 academic study, The Guillotine and the Terror, Guillotin's proposal was explicitly framed as a transitional measure, a humanitarian bridge toward abolition. A bridge. That was the word he used. So why does every history book remember him as the man who gave the revolution its killing machine? And why did the machine he designed to end suffering go on to sever more than 17,000 heads in less than 2 years? But history has a way of leaving behind traces, traces that don't fit the story we were told. To understand what the guillotine became, you have to understand what France was. By 1789, the country was collapsing under its own weight. A king who spent more on Versailles than on bread. A tax system that crushed peasants and exempted aristocrats. 17 million people living in conditions that hadn't meaningfully changed since the Middle Ages, while a few thousand nobles debated etiquette at court. When the revolution came, it didn't arrive quietly. The Bastille fell on July 14, 1789. The old legal system, with all its inequality, all its calculated cruelty, fell with it. And in the vacuum that followed, the new National Assembly faced a question that no one had thought to answer in advance. How does a republic execute people? The old methods were tainted. They carried the fingerprints of the regime the revolution had just destroyed. You couldn't keep the wheel. You couldn't keep the gallows as they were. The new France needed a new symbol, something that said, "We are not them. We are rational. We are modern. We are equal." Enter Joseph Ignace Guillotine. He was 50 years old in 1789, quietly respected. A physician who had spent his career in the unglamorous work of public health, fighting smallpox inoculation bans, reforming medical education, advocating for the poor in the hospitals of Paris. He wasn't a revolutionary firebrand. He was, by every contemporary account, a careful and methodical man. His colleague at the Assembly, Dr. Antoine Louis, Secretary of the Royal Academy of Surgery, was the one who actually designed the mechanism based on Guillotine's proposal. The device was initially called the Louisette, or the Louison, after Louis. Guillotine's name attached itself later through the cruel mechanics of popular memory. The machine was tested on corpses in April 1792. It worked. The first living execution followed on April 25, 1792. A highway robber named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. The crowd at the Place du Carrousel was reportedly disappointed. It was too fast, too clean. There was no suffering to watch. Guillotine, by all accounts, considered this a success. The Enlightenment had produced a humane killing machine. France had modernized death itself. The story, as the textbooks would later tell it, was one of rational progress. Barbarism replaced by science, inequality replaced by uniformity. It was a perfect narrative, and for approximately 4 months, it was also true. If you look at the surface, it makes sense. But the moment you scratch that surface, the whole thing starts to bleed. In September 1792, 5 months after the first guillotine execution, something shifted. It didn't happen gradually. It happened in 4 days. Between September 2nd and September 6th, 1792, mobs broke into the prisons of Paris and massacred somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 prisoners. Priests, political prisoners, common criminals. They were dragged out and killed in the streets, with pikes, with sabers, with bare hands. The guillotine wasn't fast enough for what the revolution was becoming. The September massacres, as historians now call them, were not an aberration. They were a signal. The political temperature in Paris was changing in ways that the architects of the revolution, Guillotine included, had not designed for and could not control. A new faction was rising. The Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, were consolidating power inside the Committee of Public Safety. And Robespierre had a theory about how revolutions survive. You remove the enemies. All of them. Systematically. With the full legal authority of the state. Here is where the evidence becomes uncomfortable. According to the procès-verbaux of the Committee of Public Safety, the official meeting records held in the Archives Nationales in Paris, the guillotine was formally designated as the singular instrument of execution for all capital sentences across France in March 1793. Not as a humanitarian measure this time, as an administrative one. It was a logistics decision. The revolution had too many enemies to kill slowly. What Guillotine had designed as a bridge toward abolition, a machine meant to make death so unremarkable that the public would eventually tire of it, was now being issued as standard equipment to every department in France. Portable guillotines. Regional guillotines. The proconsuls of the revolution traveled the provinces with them loaded on carts. The machine had been nationalized, and its inventor was still alive in Paris, watching. We aren't just looking at a mistake anymore. We are looking at a pattern. The terror began officially in September 1793. The Committee of Public Safety, now effectively the government of France, passed the Law of Suspects, a document so broad in its definition of enemy of the revolution that it could apply to almost anyone. According to the text of the law, preserved in the Archives Nationales, a suspect included anyone who, by their conduct, associations, talk, or writings, have shown themselves partisans of tyranny. Associations. Talk. Not actions. Not crimes. Associations and talk. The Revolutionary Tribunal, which had been created in March 1793, ostensibly to provide legal process, now processed cases in hours, sometimes minutes. Daniel Arras, in The Guillotine and the Terror, documents that at the height of the terror, in June and July 1794, the tribunal was condemning between 30 and 50 people per day. The guillotine ran continuously. What had taken the entire previous century of French judicial execution to accumulate in numbers, the terror surpassed in 10 months. 17,000 official executions between September 1793 and July 1794. And that number does not include those who died in prison awaiting trial, or the tens of thousands killed in the provincial suppressions, the mass drownings at Nantes, the shootings at Lyon, where the guillotine was considered too slow. The machine built for equality was now the engine of a bureaucratic extermination system. The Enlightenment's most rational instrument had become the terror's most efficient one. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the guillotine didn't just kill enemies of the revolution, it killed the revolution itself. Georges Danton, one of the founders of the Committee of Public Safety, the man whose voice had rallied Paris when the Prussians were at the gates, was guillotined on April 5, 1794. He had begun to argue that the terror had gone too far, that the killing needed to stop. Robespierre guillotined him for it. Camille Desmoulins, journalist, revolutionary pamphleteer, one of the men whose words had ignited the storming of the Bastille, guillotined 4 days after Danton. He had written that mercy was also a revolutionary virtue. Jacques Hébert, leader of the radical left faction, who had pushed for the terror to go further and faster than even Robespierre, guillotined in March 1794. Left, center, right. It didn't matter anymore. The guillotine had become self-referential. The revolution was now consuming the people who had built the machine that was consuming France. According to historian David Bell of Princeton University, writing in his 2015 study of the revolutionary period, the judicial logic of the terror had by mid-1794 become entirely circular. Accusation was functionally equivalent to guilt, because the system had no mechanism left for acquittal that wasn't itself suspicious. The bridge that Guillotine had designed had become a trapdoor. Joseph Ignace Guillotine was still in Paris. He didn't flee. He didn't go underground. He stayed. In the autumn of 1793, he was arrested. Not for any specific crime. Under the law of suspects, no specific crime was required. His associations were sufficient. He had been close to moderate Girondins, the faction that Robespierre was now systematically eliminating. That was enough. He was held in prison, and he waited. Every morning in Paris during the Terror, the carts came. The tumbrils, open wooden wagons, carried that day's condemned through the streets to the Place de la Révolution. The crowds gathered. The blade fell. The head was held up. Guillotine waited in his cell to hear whether his name would be called. It wasn't. Robespierre fell on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, before Guillotine's case came before the tribunal. By 24 hours, perhaps less, the man who invented the guillotine escaped the guillotine. He was released. He returned to medicine. He helped found what would become the French Academy of Medicine. He lived until 1814. He never spoke publicly about the machine again. His family, after his death, petitioned the...
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
The French government to rename the device, to sever the connection between the guillotine name and the instrument of the terror. The government refused. So the family did the only thing left to them. They changed their name. They disappeared from the historical record quietly, voluntarily, with no announcement. Exactly the way Guillotine himself had tried to disappear after 1794. The man who wanted to be remembered as a reformer spent the last 20 years of his life trying to be forgotten entirely. He almost succeeded. This isn't history. It's a warning. We like to think that tools are neutral, that a knife is just a knife, that an algorithm is just code, that a law is just words on paper until someone decides what to do with them. The guillotine is the oldest and clearest argument against that belief. Guillotine's machine was not neutral the moment it left his hands. It became what the most powerful people in the room needed it to be. First, a symbol of equality, then a symbol of efficiency, then a symbol of terror. The machine didn't change. The hands holding it did. And this pattern, a reformer builds a tool to reduce suffering. The state adopts the tool to concentrate power. The tool outlives its creator's intentions by centuries. This pattern has never stopped repeating. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin adopted emergency detention tribunals, modeled explicitly on the French Revolutionary Tribunal. He cited the Committee of Public Safety as a precedent. He knew the history. He used it anyway. The Soviet Troika system, 3-person panels that could sentence without appeal, processed hundreds of thousands of cases during the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938. Stalin's version of the law of suspects was called Article 58. Its definition of counter-revolutionary activity was, word for word, as broad as the French original. Associations, talk, writings. The language didn't change, only the geography. In 2001, the United States passed the Patriot Act in the weeks following September 11th. Sections of the law expanded the definition of domestic terrorism to include actions that appear to be intended to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Legal scholars at the time, including professors at Harvard and Georgetown, writing in the Harvard Law Review in 2002, noted that the definition was broad enough to apply to civil disobedience, protest, and political organizing under specific circumstances. The legislators who voted for it were not monsters. Most of them genuinely believed they were building a bridge. That is exactly the point. The guillotine's most important lesson is not about the French Revolution. It's about the distance between a tool's creation and its application, and how reliably that distance disappears once the tool becomes useful to power. Guillotine designed a machine to end inequality and death. Within 18 months, it was being used to enforce political conformity among the living. The mechanism was the same. The justification had simply been updated. We are still living inside systems built on that same logic. Emergency powers pass during crises that quietly outlast the crises that justified them. Surveillance tools built for terrorists that expand to cover activists. Platforms designed for connection that become engines of control. Every generation builds its own guillotine, and every generation is surprised when someone else picks it up. The next time you hear the official version of a story, ask yourself, who is holding the pen? There is a word in French, détournement. It means the hijacking of a tool or a message for a purpose opposite to its original intent. The situationists coined it in the 1950s as an artistic concept, but the guillotine invented it in 1793. Joseph Ignace Guillotine died on May 26, 1814, at the age of 75. His death was unremarkable. A small notice in the Paris medical journals, no state funeral, no monument. The man who had stood before the National Assembly with a proposal to make France more humane died in deliberate obscurity, having spent 2 decades carefully erasing himself from public life. He was a physician to the end. He treated patients in his neighborhood in Paris. He showed up. He did the quiet work. He did not give interviews. He did not write memoirs. He left behind almost no personal correspondence about the revolution, about the terror, about the machine. The silence was intentional, and it tells you everything. Because silence, for Guillotine, was the only form of protest left to him. He could not undo what had been done. He could not rename the machine. He could not reclaim his proposal from the hands that had turned it into an assembly line of death. All he could do was refuse to participate in the mythology, refuse to be the villain the history books needed, refuse to be the hero the reformers wanted, refuse to be anything at all. He chose erasure over narrative. In a century that was entirely about narrative, about who controlled the story of the revolution, who got to define its heroes and its traitors, Guillotine's final act was to opt out of the story entirely. His family finished what he started. They changed their name, packed up the guillotine identity like furniture from a house they could no longer afford to live in, and they walked away. We don't know what name they took. That's the point. What remains is the machine, still called by his name, still performing, in the popular imagination, the role of executioner, when its inventor spent his entire life trying to play a different role entirely. Here is what the guillotine actually teaches us, stripped of the mythology. Good intentions are not a shield. The moment you hand a tool to a system larger than yourself, the system decides what the tool means. Your intentions travel with it for a while, maybe months, maybe years. And then the system's needs overtake them, quietly, administratively, without drama. And the tool becomes the system's tool, and your name stays on it. Guillotine understood this too late to stop it. The question worth sitting with is not whether he was a good man or a bad man. The evidence is clear. He was a good man who built something that a bad moment turned into a catastrophe. The question is, how many tools are we building right now, with the best intentions in the world, that someone else is already figuring out how to repurpose? How many bridges are already becoming trapdoors? If a reform designed to end suffering became the instrument of 17,000 deaths, and the man who designed it spent the rest of his life in silence trying to be forgotten, what does that tell us about the reforms we celebrate today? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the financial system that was born in secret on a private island, and why the men who built it made sure you'd never learn their names. The blade, in the end, always outlasts the hand that forged it. You can't unlearn the truth. Now the question is, what will you do with it?